Right, sorry, we're gonna now continue. I was unknowingly making it take longer just to continue. George William Fairfax wrote him admiring letters, vowing that he would be honored to serve under his leadership, but Fairfax never got around to volunteering, even when his younger brother Brian joined the seemingly endless and extremely dangerous Wilderness War, and another brother became an officer in the British Regular Army. Washington's relationship to Sally Fairfax during these years resembled a roller coaster ride. He wrote her letters from the frontier, hoping she would honor him with a reply, but when his messages became too emotional, she abruptly ordered him to stop writing to her. At another point, she apparently banished him from Belvoir. He accepted this treatment with remarkable patience. In 1757, Washington suffered a physical collapse and staggered home to Mount Vernon, seriously ill with dysentery, a nameless fever, probably malaria, and a cough that reminded him alarmingly of Lawrence's fatal malady. He took to his bed in Mount Vernon and asked Sally to obtain various medicines a local doctor had recommended. George, William, and Fairfax had sailed for England to deal with his difficult relatives. His father William had recently died, giving his British cousins a chance to bring up the ruinous suspicion that George William was a mulatto. Washington's younger brother, George Augustine, or Jack, and his wife, who had been staying at Mount Vernon as caretakers, were away. Sally brought Washington his medicines, special wines, jellies, and other delicacies beyond the ability of Mount Vernon's kitchen. Was it during these months that some or all of the of the quote unquote the thousand tender passages end quote occurred that Washington struggled to forget in the letter he wrote a year later? We simply do not know. The other letters Washington and Sally exchanged have all been destroyed, except for one or two. Therefore, one or two fragments and a puzzling note that he wrote to her when he first arrived in Mount Vernon in 1757. It is as laconic and impersonal as one can imagine, asking for help with with his medicines. In mid-February, Washington received a letter from George William. He for, he's reporting that he has survived the perils of the wintry Atlantic. He forwarded it to Sally, adding, "When you are at leisure to favor us with a visit, we shall endeavor to partake as much as possible of the joy you receive on this occasion." End quote. This does not breathe deep passion, to say the least. It also suggests that Sally's visits had been infrequent. During these months, Washington was a very sick man. He wrote a plaintive letter to the doctor who had treated him on the frontier, James Craik, reporting that he was not getting better. Dr. Craik replied that he was not surprised. His malady had corrupted the whole mass of blood. Quote, corrupted the whole mass of blood. End quote. So the physician ordered the patient to stay in bed and avoid any and all exertion, saying the fate of your friends and country, he meant Virginia, are in a manner dependent on your recovery. This was flattering stuff, but not the sort of message that inspired a depressed, anxious man to become an impassioned Lothario. Something else has to be fractured into the situation at this point. Washington's relationship to the William Fairfax, had been almost as much as a substitute father as Lawrence. After Lawrence's death, William had regarded George as a member of the family and used his considerable power to push his military career whenever possible. When William Fairfax died, Washington had left his regiment and journeyed over the mountains to his funeral, ignoring the dysentery that was already making his life difficult. In a letter to his brother Jack, he remarked, quote, "To that family I am under many obligations, particularly to the old gentleman," end quote. To some extent, these obligations extended to George William Fairfax. He had befriended George, the teenage country bumpkin, as Lawrence's brother, and the relationship had remained close for the previous decade. There is not a hint in any of Washington's letters of a change in opinion or attitude, even when He emerged as Virginia's most notable military leader. So I'm just trying to see how far I would need to read. So about page 70, we're only, oh my god, we're only at 12. Oh, oh. In fact, it can be argued with some force that this role as a military hero only made the possibility of George realizing his desire for Sally Carey Fairfax more remote. In a sense, George had become the man Lawrence might have been, and that only intensified his sense of obligation to the Fairfaxes. Honor was the brightest word in Washington's vocabulary, a beacon that both guarded and guided his conduct. The thought of doing something that Lawrence would have judged grossly dishonorable was a more than reliable, believable reason why George changed his desire deep within himself. It was another lesson in the harsh school of self-control in which destiny seemed to be matriculating him. This does not mean that George Washington was inhibited by puritanical views of sexual conduct. Puritanism was almost as foreign to 18th century Virginia as Mohammedanism. Mohammedanism. Life on the frontier was by no means devoid of women. Every 18th century army had, quote, camp women, end quote, who were married or pretended to be married to soldiers and followed them into the war zone. One of his officers wrote to Washington while he was home on leave, wondering if he, quote, plunged in delight and enchanted by charms even stranger to the Cyprian dame, end quote. Cyprian dame was an available woman, sometimes a prostitute. I know, in political correctness like that. Officer wrote him from South Carolina, telling him that the local woman lacking the, quote, enticing, heavy, throbbing, alluring, plump breast common with our northern belles, end quote. Such letters have enabled some writers to imagine a blazing convert affair between Sally and George that lasted months or even years. Far stranger is evidence that suggests Washington struggled to put Sally out of his mind and future. George pursued several other women, notably strong-willed Mary Phillips Harris to a swath of the Hudson River Valley, but his efforts were half-hearted proof it might seem either of his longing for Sally or of Mary's temperamental resemblance to Mary Ball Washington. This was the situation in March 1758, when the ailing bachelor, still convinced that he was in his final days, mounted his horse and rode slowly to Williamsburg to see Dr. John Anson, the best physician in Virginia, hoping against hope that this medico might have a cure, but fearing that he would deliver a death sentence. Before he departed, George told his British superior on the frontier, Colonel John Stanwix, that he, quote, ruined my constitution, end quote, and was thinking of, quote, quitting my command, end quote. He was convinced that he had tuberculosis and force a little, but, quote, approaching decay, end quote. To Washington's amazement and delight, Dr. Anson assured him that he was recovering nicely and had prospects of living to a vigorous old age. The reincarnated patient strode into Williamsburg's spring sunshine and began thinking about what to do with the rest of his life. One of his first thoughts was marriage. The sequence inclines his writer to wonder if during the long winter of his illness, he and Sally had not told each other, or at least hinted that they realized their love had no future. Another scenario, perhaps more likely, has Washington reaching this glum but unavoidable conclusion during the long, lonely night hours in his sick bed. Realistically, in 1758 Virginia, there was no way that Colonel George Washington could marry Sally Carey Fairfax. It would have triggered an immense scandal that would have made them both social outcasts. A clandestine affair could have easily led to the same result. Either way, Washington could would have exposed himself to a ruinous lawsuit from her outraged husband. Lurking in the background of both their minds was a memory of an earlier sex scandal. Lawrence Washington had sued a neighbor, accusing him of uh, I'm going to use a different word, sexually assaulting Anne Fairfax before her marriage. The lawsuit had been reported in a salacious detail in newspapers throughout Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Before it was over, everyone wished Lawrence had never mentioned the incident to anyone, no matter how much the vile deed may have haunted his wife. With marriage on his mind, Colonel Washington rode from Williamsburg to the nearby state known as the White House on the Pamunkey River to visit Martha Dandridge Custis. They undoubtedly knew each other already. The elite society of Eastern Virginia was fairly small, and Martha and her husband, Daniel Parke Custis, had participated in its lively social world with enthusiasm. George and Martha had probably met and may have danced at more than one fancy dress ball in Williamsburg. A recent widow, Martha was receiving a veritable steam of suitors in Virginia. In Virginia during these years, money was frankly accepted as a significant item in a marriage. Newspapers regularly stated the amount of a bride's net worth. Elizabeth Stice, for instance, was described as a very amiable lady with a fortune of £1,000 sterling. Cash was often the baldly stated reason for mingling youth and age. Such women aspired to, and often expected, a certain amount of respect and independence. In Martha Dandridge Custis' case, she could expect a great deal of respect and virtually unlimited freedom of choice. She was the richest widow in Virginia. George was more than pleased with Martha's warm, affable manner and was even more charmed when she invited him to stay overnight. He played cheerfully with her two children, John, 4, and Patsy, 2. Oh my god, I'm not even here. As he departed, he tipped her servants extravagantly, a sure sign that he wanted their comments about him to be favorable. A week later, he returned for another visit, and something seemed to have been arranged. On May 4th, the colonel ordered a ring from Philadelphia and a suit of superfine broadcloth from London to fit a quote tall man end quote. By this time, he was back on the frontier, once more in command of his regiment. They were soon part of another British army committed to ousting the French from Fort Duquesne. Here, the aftershock of the turmoil stirred by the New York Herald's publication of the letter to Sally Fairfax intrudes on our story. On July 20th, 1758, George Washington supposedly wrote in a letter to Martha Custis, "We had begun our march for the Ohio, a career starting from Williamsburg, and I embrace the opportunity to send a few words to one whose life is now inseparable from mine. Since that happy hour when we made our pledge to each other, my thoughts have been continually going to you as to another self. That an all-powerful Providence may keep us both in safety is the prayer of your ever faithful and affectionate friend." A number of reputable historians have concluded this letter is a forgery. It was included in the first two editions of Washington's papers, but John C. Fitzpatrick noted tersely the location of the original is not known. Perhaps most important, the statement about beginning a march to the Ohio is wrong. On July 20th, much to Washington's exasperation, the British army was still sitting on the edge of the wilderness debating which route to take. He was not even sure he and his troops would be included in the expedition. Furthermore, the word courier was never used by Washington during these years. He preferred express. Other words in the letter strike similar false notes. Perhaps the most convincing, the style is extravagantly emotional for a man who spent comparatively little time with Miss Custis. Where did the letter come from? Was it concocted in an attempt to counter the 1877 revelation of the letter to Fairfax? We know this much. It first appeared in 1886 in a sentimental biography of Martha Washington titled "Martha and Mary, Mother and Wife of George Washington." The author, Benjamin Lossing, claimed he had seen the original, but it was never found by anyone else. It seems likely the letter was forged by someone who was trying to make the letter to Sally seem like a fake. It might have been written by a Washington family descendant who imposed it on Lossing, or by someone who else with patriotic motives, such as the mystery purchaser of the letter to Sally Fairfax in 1877. These explanations enable us to see Colonel Washington grumbling and cursing in Fort Cumberland, Maryland, while the British ignored his advice on the best way to march on Fort Duquesne. Meanwhile, the evidence of George's plan for the future were unfolding at Mount Vernon, which George had decided to expand and rebuild with all possible speed. George William Fairfax, back from Europe, was asked to help with advice and supervision. This inevitably led to Washington telling him about his engagement with Martha Custis. Fairfax naturally told his wife about this interesting change in the fortunes of the mutual friend, into an envelope with a letter from George William about the Mount Vernon renovation. Sally slipped a letter of her own, with that mocking style she preferred. Sally apparently teased Washington about complaints that the campaign was moving too slowly. Was he impatient because he had become a votary of love? She was, of course, referring to his engagement to Martha Custis. But the lonely warrior facing an Indian rife wilderness in which there was a strong possibility of a bullet with his name on it read a very different meaning into the inquiry. What came back to Sally was nothing less than an explosion. A jumbled cry of anguish from a man who could bury his feelings no longer. As usual, Sally was discreet. Her answer was apparently indirect. Some historians think she pretended Washington was joking. The letter is lost. We only have Washington's answer. Do we still misunderstand the true meaning of each other's letters? I think must appear to so, though I would fain hope the contrary, as I cannot speak plainer without. But I'll say no more and leave you to guess the rest. He gloomed. He gloomily added that he was almost certain the expedition to the Ohio would end in disaster. Then he added words that he had deemed meaning for both of them. Quote, I should think my time more agreeable spent, believe me, playing a part in Cato with the company you mentioned, and myself doubly happily in being the Joba to such a Marcia as you must make. Unquote. He closed with some offhand speculation on the marital plans of several friends, but had no mention of his own. Then came a last burst of emotion. One thing more, and I have done. You ask if I am not tired of the length of your letter. No, madame, I am not, nor never can be while the lines are on an inch asunder to bring you in haste to the end of the paper. You may be tired of mine by this. Adieu, dear madame. You possibly will hear something of me or from me before we shall meet. Believe me that I am most unalterably your most obedient and obliged. In the surviving letters to Sally, Washington never before wrote, unquote, most unalterably, unquote. Once more, he was telling her the secret that they would share for the rest of their lives. They were lovers that destiny had tragically separated, as history had never parted as history had forever parted Marcia and Juba. 4 months after he reveals this passionate longing, George Washington married Martha Custis. If romance was not uppermost in his mind, there is evidence that Martha had felt a few tremors. Her first husband, Daniel Parcustis, had been 15 years older than she, and he was by most accounts a rather pathetic, though extremely handsome man. Browbeaten all his life by a miserly father, towering Colonel Washington was not only Virginia's foremost soldier, but he must have been a breathtaking sight in the suit of a superfine blue cotton broadcloth that he had ordered from England for his wedding. To the end of her life, Martha saved a piece of her wedding dress, deep yellow brocaded satins threaded with silver, and the white gloves her new husband had worn to the ceremony. We know, or at least speculate, that Martha Dangerous Custis was more than a little pleased by George Washington's proposal. But this does not tell us much about her. There were undoubtedly a great many women in Virginia who would have felt a few shivers at the thought of being embraced by the famous Colonel Washington. For some people, Martha's wealth has complicated and even distorted her in the marriage. Even when Washington was in his second term as president, a man inflamed by the politics of the day shouted at him, "What would you have been if you had not married the widow Custis?" This crass view of the match as a marriage of ultimate convenience has led to others to annotate with various degree of weariness what Washington obtained when he said, "I do." Daniel Parke Custis had died without a will, which left Martha in charge of his 17,430 estate, all prime land within a 40-mile radius of Williamsburg. An early state estimate of its value was £23,622, well over $303 million in today's money. And I'm not too sure when this was published, the book exactly. I'm trying to see. Yeah, I can't really tell at the moment. I'm trying to figure out when the book itself was published. Um, 2009. So this was a book in 2009, by the way, and I guess it was published by. Oh, holy, what's that? Crap. Um, it was a hardcover copy of this book was published in 2009 by HarperCollins publisher. So I guess this is a HarperCollins. Yeah, it's a HarperCollins hardcover. I mean, it doesn't feel and sound hard, but it's pretty different hard book, I guess. Um, a third of that sum was Martha's, and the rest would go to her two children. So the entire enterprise was the responsibility for decades to come. The moment George became her husband, Martha's one-third was his property, and he became the administrator of the children's portions. From a cash-short landowner with a few thousand acres, Washington, like his brother Lawrence before him, ascended into Virginia's upper class. The cynics would note this miraculous transformation, often forgot that it was a marriage of convenience for Martha, too. She knew little or nothing about managing a huge estate. It involved dealing with overseers, worries over runaway or recalcitrant slaves, and the problems with livestock and tenant farmers, and with shipping tobacco to London, where insurance rates were skyrocketing because of the ongoing war with France. Moreover, the Curtis estate had a worrisome lawsuit looming on the legal horizon, stemming from the will of Daniel Parke Custis's Raquel grandfather. He named as one of his heirs an illegitimate daughter he had fathered in Antigua, and her descendants were threatening to sue in Virginia for a share of his estate in that colony. The final verdict went the wrong way. Martha could lose almost all the property she had inherited. This is another reason why she wanted and needed a man of cool judgment in her life. Her choice of Colonel Washington, who had managed large affairs during the war and was intimate with the ruling politicians of Virginia, and indicated that she had not a little common sense in her makeup, which the tremors of possible romance did not by any means obscure. Historians and historical novelists had long disagreed about Martha's looks. Some report her as ugly or at best plain. One 1784 visit to Mount Vernon even found fault with her, quote, squeaky voice, end quote. Unfortunately for Martha, she did not become a subject for her first-rate portrait painters or a personage to be studied by a personage to be studied by random visitors. Until she was long past her youth. Most of her likeness was painted when she was in her 60s and the wife of the first president. One writer sourly wondered why she persisted in wearing those silky mop caps that made her look so old. Martha, of course, merely dressing her age. Luckily, a traveling painter named John Wollaston has left us a portrait of Martha in 1757 when she was still Miss Custis. She is unquestionably an attractive young woman with large hazel eyes and curly brown hair. Her forehead was wide and fine, her strong nose and firmly rounded chin added an air of self-confidence, which was equally visible in her small, firm mouth. She was barely 5 feet tall, but her figure was full and even eye-catching. One recent biographer called her a pocket Venus, a petite, cuddlesome armful. By the time she married Washington, Martha had gained enough weight to be considered plump by some people, but the added pounds did not diminish her physical charm. Even more important in appreciating Martha Danger Custis's appeal to her husband is her personality. Almost everyone who met her was pleased by her warm, relaxed manner. Very early in life, she revealed a startling capacity to charm the male sex. The Dandridges were middling gentry, like the Washingtons. Everyone was agog when Daniel Parkhurst, one of the richest men in the colony, fell in love with Martha. The Dandridges had very little cash to spare for a dowry. Daniel's father, Colonel John Custis, already famous for his foul temper, vowed to disinherit his son if he married a penniless Dandridge. For several months, this edict stalemated matters. Daniel had no appetite. Daniel had no appetite for arguing with his headstrong parent. John Curtis worsened matters by threatening to leave his entire estate to Jack, a mulatto boy who he had fathered with Alice, one of his slaves. Daniel and everyone else knew he was more than capable of such a bizarre gesture. Soon the imbroglio was the talk of Virginia, with gossips gleefully reporting John Custis' his latest outrageous remark. At one point, he gave silver engraved with the Custis coat of arms to an innkeeper's wife to make sure it would never be owned by any Dangerous' daughter. The woman displayed the gift in her Williamsburg tavern. Who could possibly resolve such an ugly contrepts? Martha Dangerous decided to try. She rode to Williamsburg and confronted the old tyrant in his home on Francis Street. Face to face, the colonel turned into a paper tiger and then into a pussycat. He was inspired by Martha's courage and pleased by her calm, even temper, and the direct, sensible way she talked to him about herself and his son. Daniel sent one of his friends, a lawyer named Power, to see his father. He discovered that Colonel Custis had changed his mind about the marriage. The Custises were rich, and his son did not need a dowry to marry Martha Dandridge. The lawyer Russ Daniels, astounding news. Quote, I am empowered by your father to let you know he heartily and willingly consents to your marriage with Miss Dandridge. Power attributed this miraculous transformation to a prudent speech that Martha had made to the colonel. He is now as much enamored with her character as you are with her person. Power continued. Hurry down here immediately, for fear he should change the strong inclination he has to you marrying directly. This episode tells us much about Martha Dangerous Custis Washington. She may have lacked Sally Fairfax's education and interest in art and literature, but she was no plain Jane, who was happy to be a humble echo of her outsized second husband. George had not been the only candidate for Miss Custis' affections. Before Colonel Washington had made his first visit, Martha had been pursued by one of the richest men in Virginia, Charles Carter, son of fabulously wealthy Robert King Carter. Charles' wife had died about 6 months before Daniel Custis, and he frankly confessed that a widower's life made him miserable. Miss is now the object of my wish, Charles Carter told his brother. He praised Martha's beauty, and especially significant her quote uncommon sweetness of temper, end quote. Although he was 23 years older than Martha, Carter hoped to raise a flame in her breast, end quote. He was still a vigorous man who dressed well and was the ultimate social insider. But Carter had fathered no less than a dozen children, and 10 of them were still living at home. Martha, again exercising her gifts of common sense as well as frankness, told him she hoped to have more children. She wondered whether she or anyone was capable of managing such a huge family with its inevitable jealousies between half brothers and or sisters. It is not hard to see how Colonel George Washington, single, childless, and almost exactly her own age, had a far greater appeal to this practical young woman. The newlyweds spent the first few months of their married life at Martha's White House plantation and the Custis House in Williamsburg, while George attended the House of Burgesses. Martha undoubtedly glowed with pride when he received the unanimous thanks of the legislature for his 5 years of service on the frontier. They joined in the parties and balls that enlivened the little colonial capital. Both loved to dance and performed all the popular steps of the day, from stately minuets to more intimate alumnades to interject American gigs, American gigs, and reels that often sent European visitors fleeing to the sidelines, claiming that the irregular and fantastical style threatened their quote sinews end quote. The Washingtons were young, rich, and with every reason in the world to enjoy themselves. Not until April 2nd, 1759, did they take the road to Mount Vernon. Martha and the children traveled in the Custis family coach. Washington rode his horse beside them, but behind them came wagons that carried 12 slave servants from the White House, including a cook, a waiter, and a seamstress. Um, a seamstress and a laundress. In other wagons were no fewer than 6 beds, several chests of drawers, linens, silverware, two sets of china, and dozens of pieces of kitchenware. And still more wagons rattled 120 barrels of wine, casks of rum and brandy, numerous hams, plus a large supply of cheeses and sugar. Martha was obviously operating on the assumption that setting up a household in a bachelor establishment such as Mount Vernon was equivalent to a venture into the wilderness. Colonel Washington may have added to this impression with an anxious letter he rushed ahead to his overseer, urging him to get out the chairs and tables, clean the rooms, start fires on the fireplace, and make a point of polishing the stairs to, quote, make it look well, end quote. At Mount Vernon, Martha soon began making lists of furniture and other expensive items for Robert Carey, the London merchant who handled such purchases for the Custises and many other wealthy Virginians. One of her most interesting orders was a bedroom set featuring a 7.5 foot tall canopy bed with blue, Martha's favorite color, curtains and matching coverlet, wallpaper, and window curtains, plus 4 chair bottoms of the same color to make the whole furniture of this room uniformly handsome and genteel. Mr. Carey was soon inundated with similar orders to convert the rest of the Mount Vernon from its bachelor bareness to a comfortable, attractive home. Also on the purchase list were amenities such as the quote pipe of the best old wine from the best house and Madeira, and quote a pipe if it survived the high seas without being tapped by thirsty sailors, would deliver 126 gallons of Colonel Washington's favorite wine. And I'm going to stop there and continue another time because also my computer's starting to get a bit low in terms of battery. So I'm going to probably stop here and then continue later probably.